Worlds. Worlds are an aspect of many video games that define the game itself. The world of a game houses the game itself, and its many mechanics, its plot, sets the tone, the setting, and the gameplay pacing, among many other things. Some worlds are linear and require the player's skill to navigate through them, while others are vast and allow the player to discover the world at their own will. I would argue that the world is one of the most important aspects of a game, and that's what I'm highlighting in today's video. Hello everyone, and welcome to a new devlog for my hack and slash shopkeeping RPG called Treasure and Trade. This devlog is the somewhat delayed world design devlog. For context, if this is your first video, I said in previous videos that they were going to be the world design devlogs. However, they weren't. At the time, my game just wasn't ready for it. But since then, I've had some much needed time to figure out how to actually make a map, and I've gotten the structure of the map designed at least. It's still nowhere near complete, and it's not going to be there for a long time. I plan to fill this map with many locations, and some of them are implemented, but very much in the design phases rather than the finishing touch phases. However, on a more positive note, it's not just a flat map with some hills anymore. There's actual biomes and varying heights. And I know it's been some time since the last devlog, but trust me, I have been working on the game as much as I possibly can. It's just that my life has gotten very chaotic since then. Though I can't really complain that much because I've had a nice change of scenery. I've gotten to see and experience some very interesting things, and I've gotten to spend a lot of time with my friends and family. But that's enough about me though. I know what you're here for. You're here to see what I've done with my game. So, I'll have changes about my life at the end of the video, for those who are interested. So let's look at the map now. Since the last video, I've done something big to the map. The map you saw in the last video is gone. I deleted it. I must say, building a map from scratch is a very daunting task. There's nothing that kills your creativity more than a large blank canvas. So this time, when redesigning my map, I decided to go a more procedural route. When I say that, your mind probably jumps to random generation, which isn't wrong. It's not random generation at runtime. Instead, I took a page from my favorite game studio's book, Bethesda Game Studios, and applied their method of world creation to my world. Ever since the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, Bethesda has been using procedural generation in their world design. First, they generate the terrain before designing the world. This is because it eliminates you having to start from scratch and designing the terrain itself. Instead, you can focus on making locations and content. You no longer have to make a landmass by hand on top of creating the content on it. You can skip to the content rather quickly. Plus, the main terrain often looks strange if you don't know what you're doing, which was my case. So, I decided to generate it. Then, you can make changes to it as you see fit, such as flattening hills, making cliffs, ravines, etc. Personally, I have found that having a predefined landmass has also boosted my creativity when it comes to designing locations, such as this farm at the bottom of this island which connects the lower section of the map. I also found an asset which allows you to automatically paint your terrain for you using different values like height, slope, and splat maps, which are essentially large black and white textures that are used to combine textures over top of a model. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Unreal Engine has this functionality out of the box, but I think that's more of just Unity lagging behind in the terrain department. Either way, this asset has helped me immensely, and I can't recommend it enough. The automatic nature of the tool made designing terrain way less time consuming. For example, I can create ravines and have its walls automatically texture themselves based on slope. Plus, the splat maps allowed me to create biomes, which really broke up the visual repetition of the old map. When I was designing my map, I made large changes to the bottom of the procedural map. At the bottom, I designed the area to have terrain very similar to in and around the Mediterranean coast, and the white cliffs of Dover found in England. The terrain has nice golden plains like in the Mediterranean, while also having huge cliffs that lead out to the sea, such as the cliffs of Dover. Overall, I feel like this region is pretty inspired. Down here I've already had ideas for different vineyard locations, and this area of the map particularly has the most work done to it, and it's also the most exciting for me. I also have the other biomes of my map decided, but the others aren't nearly as complete as the area that I've dubbed the Aureate Coast, which is a fancy way to say the Golden Coast. Also, I've been going around the map and finding spots for locations. Right now, I'm just placing down boxes and naming them the location's name, but I'm actually writing down their functionality in my design documents. I also made a new feature for the overworld, which is a chunk system, and a random encounter system that uses the chunks as well. Basically, the map is broken into chunks, and then each chunk will check if the player is close enough to it and how far they are from it. Each chunk has a set list of encounter points inside of it, along with a list of all the assets that can be respawned inside of the chunk. Then, whenever the player loads into the chunk by getting close enough to it, all the encounter points pick an encounter from a dynamic list which takes level, time of day, and in the future weather into account. And then from there, it'll just spawn the encounters in. Encounters can range from a single enemy to a group of enemies, friendly NPCs, ransacked carriages, and anything else I can really dream of. This will allow for randomized content to fill out the world, allowing for varying and seemingly endless adventures for the player. Right now, in terms of development, I'm mainly just coming up with location ideas. The main problem is I just don't have the art to do it right now. Although you would not think about it, creating 3D assets is very time consuming, and when building an open world, you'll need a lot of 3D assets. When creating the assets, you have to think about how they all fit together, how they all look cohesive. It's a very intensive process, much more than I ever thought it would have been. Well, that could just be because I suck at art. For example, I needed to create the assets for a blacksmith's inside of the player's village. In total, this location took around 3 hours to work on, and that was including its functionality and all the assets inside of it, which are still not even textured. At least all these assets can be reused sometime in the future when I'm making another blacksmith. Also, I've been working on my terrible drawing skills. I've been working on drawing my assets before I actually make them based off of what's in my head, so that the assets have a much more realized and fully fleshed out feel to them. For example, here's a barrow that I designed, which is a kind of burial from ancient cultures. This barrow will be located behind the starting village, and it's going to be one of the major dungeons inside of the game. I've also been drawing different enemies, different props and assets, so I'm working on it. Right now, the main problem I have is just figuring out how to texture. That's the one thing I struggle with the most, and I'll be completely honest about that. The modeling I have some issues doing, but for the most part I'm getting my bearings. But texturing is just a whole other work of art that I don't understand how to do. I'm learning how to do trim sheets and... what the hell are they called? I'm just going to call them tiles. It's a big grid and it has a bunch of colors, and then you can UV map onto those colors. So I mean, it does fit the art style of my game, which is supposed to be cartoonish and almost toy-like, but still, adding detail to objects is giving me a really rough time. So for now, get used to seeing a bunch of yellow and white and weird checkerboard textures until they are textured. I really want to spend a lot of time on the lore and world building with this project, because that's what I personally find enjoyable about games, such as Skyrim or Zelda, just interconnected worlds that have a lot of backstory to them. Very interesting to me. And I want that for my game, and I also feel as if a game about finding treasure should have a lot of interesting stories, because if the treasure had no backstory, it wouldn't feel as rewarding to find it. On the topic of quests, I've also started working on the main quest line for my game. By that, I mean actually implementing it into the game. So far, the only bit that's been implemented is the intro, which serves as a quick tutorial for shopkeeping, dialogue, and combat. Plus, it quickly establishes the main goal and plot of the story. Once you complete the first few main quests, which are pretty linear, the main story will still continue to be linear. However, the game will open up a ton to the player, allowing for player agency and discovery. Once those first few quests have been completed and the game has opened up, then I'll give the player a large goal, which is very ambiguous, and it will kind of allow for a mystery which they'll have to chase. Although I'd like to touch on the plot and story of the main quest, I think it would be better for me to keep it to myself so that you guys can discover it when the game releases. However, I do have one small thing to share about the intro. Actually, it's not a small thing. It completely changed the art direction for my game. Now, me including a character creator is a massive contradiction to something that I said in my previous devlogs, where I wanted all the characters to kind of be ambiguous. However, this change to my game was extremely beneficial in many different ways. The main benefit is now the player has complete control over how their character looks. It'll allow for a much more tailor-made player experience. These changes in character design were ported over to all the NPCs as well, which will allow for much more unique and inspired designs. I like that my characters have a nice toy-like design rather than a realistic one. I intentionally increased their head sizes and kept their bodies pretty short, small, so that it would fit nicely into the art of my game, which has a very toy and plasticky design. Plus, I also have a random look generator script which I can throw on NPCs, so they'll just kind of randomly generate appearances at runtime, which would be useful for different customers, bandits, things like that. Nondescript NPCs that are just kind of there to fill out the world. Reworking the character art also made me realize how flat the combat animations felt. They were only using the player's upper body instead of the full body, and this is because I thought it would be nice to let the player move while fighting. However, I went back on that idea and decided to pause the player in place to make them fully commit to their attacks. So because of that, I was able to make the animations full body rather than just upper body, and it allows for much more dynamic and more visceral attack animations. Reworking the characters and their proportions has also made me make a ton of changes to the world itself and all of the assets inside of it. There's actually too many changes to list here, but just know I have done a lot of updating to the art to make it kind of more centered around the characters. Since my last devlog, I also worked on adding some more placeholder effects to my game. Obviously, they're placeholder, but they still convey what I'm going for, and they'll obviously be improved upon before release. An example of one of these effects, which isn't actually that placeholder, is now I paused the game for a few frames in between all of the players' attacks to add more weight to the combat. Particles created during combat also have lights in them now, so it adds the visual feedback and impact. Combo finishers create a yellow damage number to indicate that it did more damage, and the player slows down after a dodge, and they have sweating effects to indicate that they're slowed. While I was working on added functionality to my combat system, I also made some fundamental changes to how the dodge worked. Before, the player could spam dodges without any penalty, but now the character slows down in between dodges in order to punish the player from spamming the dodge button. The changes made to my combat system also warranted a complete rewrite of my movement system. I gutted the entire script and started from scratch again, this time using physics-based movement rather than transform-based movement. If that means nothing to you, I was essentially teleporting the player each frame. This would cause weird clipping issues on walls and slopes and in the environment, so I changed it to a velocity-based system. The new system uses instant velocity changes, which better interacts with Unity's built-in physics system, which causes smoother movement across the board, which makes the combat also feel much nicer. I also switched how the auto navigation works on mouse and keyboard controls. Before, the player would automatically pathfind to wherever the player would let go of the mouse after walking. But I realized this would probably lead to frustration because you would need to place your mouse where you wanted to stop moving, and it would also interfere with combat a lot. So I decoupled that functionality from the walking button and placed it on the middle mouse button instead. Also, now when you hover over an enemy and click to attack them, if there's any distance between the player and the enemy, the player will automatically close that gap by just pathfinding to them and then attacking once they're in range of them. This range is based off of the weapon's range. This solves an issue where some weapons would have an extremely small range and it wasn't communicated well to the player because it's in isometric spaces, it's kind of hard to judge distance, so it would often lead to a lot of confusion on the player's part why their attacks weren't connecting. So now the player will automatically walk up to the enemy and fill that gap for you. I think this greatly smooths out my combat system and puts it in a place where I'm more happy with it. I think that's all for this devlog. I make my devlogs in a pretty stupid and counterintuitive way for me to write them. I'll basically just work on my game for a long period of time and then record nothing at all while I'm doing it. And then when it comes time to make a video, I have no material. And then I just have to basically remind myself what I worked on for the past couple months beforehand. It's a really bad way to write these things. It also doesn't help that my schedule has been very busy as of late. Since the last devlog, I graduated from high school, got a full-time job, saw family and friends many times, so I've just been away from my computer a lot. Although I do have less time to devote to my game, I still am trying to devote as much of it as possible to my game. Right now, my priorities are split between number 1, work, number 2, health and fitness, and then number 3, my game. For the next year, I'll just be working a full-time job until I eventually go to university. I think it'd be wise for me to take the year off, work up the money, and then go to university, rather than just going to university without any money and then having to go take out student loans and get very much in debt. University is extremely expensive here in Canada, and I presume it is globally as well. So for the time being, I'll just be working in some capacity, whether on myself, my game, or work. Next fall, I plan on either taking computer science or game design straight up, but it also doesn't help my case that all of the best courses are out of town from where I am. So that's going to make my university experience even more expensive for me. I don't like to talk about myself very much, but I thought it'd be important to explain my current situation for those of you who are wondering. However, I hope I can get some content out, at least sooner, but I think that that's all I have for now. Anyways, thank you for watching my video if you got this far, and I really don't know how to do an outro, so